All right, let's get started, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Virtual Science Cafe. I'm your host. My name is Chris Smith. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here for our program tonight. We've got a great program set up for you tonight. And as always, I hope that you've got your thinking caps on, but you might need two thinking caps for the program tonight because we are going to discuss the book Some We Love, Some We Hate, and Some We Eat, Why It's So Hard to Think Straight About Animals, with psychologist and Professor Emeritus at Western Carolina University and the author of said book, Dr. Hal Herzog. Hal, welcome to Science Cafe.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, you and I have had a couple of brief conversations in the lead up to tonight, and every single one of them has been a head scratcher and leaves me just thinking about so much, because you study the way that humans interact with the animals all around us in so many different contexts, and trying to help us understand ourselves through that research.
Yeah, that's right. My little section of psychology is how we think about and act towards and relate to members of other species. And it's my view that animals play a role in almost every aspect of human life. And so for me, it's just a wonderful window to look into what makes us human and the best and the worst in human nature.
Yeah, it's some of those questions that you posed about the worst really get the mind working. And so before we jump right in, I'll remind everybody that as we go through tonight's program, you can leave your thoughts, insights, and questions in the chat box, whether you're watching on YouTube or over on Facebook. Leave your thoughts there. We'll be keeping an eye on them and moderating. And then a little bit later in the program, we'll pose those questions and thoughts back to tonight's guest. I also want to remind everybody that you can purchase Hal's book, Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat, from the museum store online. I'm going to drop a link to the museum store in the chat box in just a moment, but you can click the link, go to the museum, and if you're local to the Raleigh area, you could go pick the book up, or you can have it shipped to you. And I believe this is right, they're all signed copies now. So everybody, pick up your signed copy of Hal's book. So Hal, if you want to jump into your slideshow and give us a sort of primer on what you study, what the book is about, and what folks are going to get from tonight.
Sure, let's do it real quick. And this is just going to be a real quick overview, maybe 10 minutes or so. It won't take too long. Let's see if I can get this thing working. Here we go. So the name of the book is Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat, Why It's So Hard to Think Straight About Animals. And that's sort of been my passion really for the past 30 years. I've been trying to answer that question. Why is it so hard to think straight about animals? So let's take a little overview here. And unfortunately, here we go. Okay. So thorny animal issues are in the news. There's lots and lots of them. So for example, right now we're in the age of COVID. And here's a couple of things that I just grabbed real quick related to the use of one of the most controversial, one of the most philosophically interesting and personally diverse, sort of the ways that humans fight over the use of animals is their use in research. And so, for example, what about the question of using primates for the development of COVID vaccines? And here's two articles, one of which appeared in Science magazine, which is basically saying we need more primate research, monkey research to develop these vaccines. And here's another article that I just saw today saying that no, the implications of COVID are that we're going to need less and eventually phase out animal testing altogether. So we see these kind of conflicts all the time, and this falls within the bailiwick of a new discipline, a new science called anthrozoology. the study of human-animal relationships. And we study lots of things. We study all the way from our relationships with pets, which is probably what most anthrozoologists study, to why people hunt and why they fish. And I've studied things like why people protest why people become animal rights activists. But I've also studied individuals like cockfighters and veterinary students and circus animal trainers in terms of the moral dilemmas that they work with. And the field has absolutely exploded. I began to work in this area back in the late 80s and early 90s. And every year there would be a handful of papers that would come out in obscure journals. And as you can see, it's just absolutely taken off. This is the number of research papers published per year using Google Scholar. I just typed in, human-animal interactions. You can see we've gone from almost no papers per year to nowadays almost 1,000 papers per year. It's just really hard to keep up. This is a really exciting research area. I'm in it because, as the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss said, animals are good to think with. So those of you who are at home, let's think about animals. And if we were in a big auditorium there at the museum, this is what I would do, is I'd say, let's think about animals. And let's think about 3 types of animals. One, an animal, that little girl, she's an animal. That dog, and that most interesting one in some ways is Sony's robotic pet, which they call Aibo. And you can have Aibo, it's available. It'll cost you a lot of money, about $3,000. And it's an amazing thing. Sony sent me Aibo to play with for a month. They let me have Aibo for a month in my house. And it was amazing. It would bark. It would look at me. If I said good Aibo, it would wag its tail. If I said bad dog, it would get a frowny face. It could even sing happy birthday and give me a high five. So in some ways, it was, it could do all the stuff a regular dog could do in some ways. But the question is that I would ask you, if we were sitting around in the Natural Sciences Auditorium, in the museum's auditorium, do these creatures have, and I'd say, what about the dog? What about the kid? What about Aibo? Emotions, thoughts, a mind, and a sense of right and wrong. But I can't see you at home, but I've done this enough times, and I've taken surveys of students and audiences when I've done it, that I know what you would probably say. And what you would probably say, when it came to emotions, you would probably say that 100% of the children and close to 100% of the dog experienced emotions. Ditto thoughts. You would think that the kid have thoughts, and most of you would think 95% would say that the dog had thoughts. Ditto mind. And even morality. Morality goes down a little lower for the kid and for the dog. But notice how low. Very few people thought that Aibo experienced emotions, thoughts, minds, and morality. And by the way, when I would ask the people that said that, yes, they had things like morality, I would ask them, well, why they think that? And it turned out that almost all of them were computer science majors. And they had actually thought about these issues sort of, deeply. The computers have minds. But for the most of us, we don't think that. So, but this raises the real problem. If animals are so much like us, if they have mind, if they have emotions, if they have a moral sense, why is it okay for us to kill them, and why is it okay for us to eat them? So that's the elephant in the room. So let's take a look at 2 animal lovers, and one of them was an animal lover that got me interested in this area, a fellow named Eddie Buckner. Who I met when I was doing research on cockfighting for my doctoral dissertation back in the 1980s. And my doctoral dissertation started out being on chicken behavior, but it turned out some of my neighbors were rooster fighters, and I wound up hanging around with them. And I shifted to basically being an anthropologist and looking at the psychology of people being involved in this brutal blood sport, and studying that culture and their moral sense, how they morally justify this. I don't have time to go through all that, but I'll just say about Eddie, he was typical. The most interesting thing about Eddie, cockfighter, is how just perfectly normal the guy was. He was not some psychosexual sadist that you would have thought. He was a regular person. He was married. He had kids. He was a good Christian. He went to church on Sundays. He had an important job. And this one little weirdness in his life was that on Saturday nights, he would take these roosters that he loved in his own way and worked with and raised from when they were chicks, and he would fight them in these derbies in which half of them would die that night. And my goal was to try and wrap my head around that. I never quite was able to do it, but I came close. But then there was another animal lover that I became aware of not long after that, Adolf Hitler, mass murderer. So with Eddie Buckner, we have a good person that does bad things. I think it's safe to say that with Adolf Hitler, we have a very, very bad person. But it turns out he was an animal lover. He was a vegetarian. He always had pets. He enacted. He had when the Nazis took over the government of Germany. They enacted the world's first major animal protection legislation. They banned the use of animals in most biomedical research. They banned hunting with dogs, a whole slew of things. And it wasn't just Hitler. It was the many people in the German hierarchy. I think it was Hermann Göring that said one time, if someone's mean to an animal, I'll put them in a concentration camp. And furthermore, this to me is the biggest thing I can't wrap my head around. I still can't do it. In 1942, the Nazis decided that the Jews should not own pets. So they rounded up all the dogs and cats owned by Jews in Berlin, and they killed them. They killed all the pets. But the Germans had enacted the world's first humane slaughter act. And so they killed the pets of the Jews humanely, according to the Nazi humane slaughter laws. At the same time, they were putting people in the concentration camps, and they were not protected by the humane slaughter. So I was giving a talk about this one time. I was first getting interested in this stuff. I was going to talk in a meeting in Boston, and Andrew Rowan had put the meeting together, and he came up to me after my talk. And he said, you know how the only thing consistent about human attitudes towards animals is inconsistency. And that has been rattling around in my head for 30 years. So let's look at some examples of moral inconsistency amongst Americans. Gallup poll asked a random sample of Americans, adults, what rights should animals have? Should they have? I was shocked to find that 2/3 of the respondents said that animals should have the exact same rights as people. 30% said that animals should have some protection, but not the same as people. And then a small number said animals should have not much protection. But think about that, 36% said that animals should have the same rights as people. Now, do we talk the talk, or is this just all, malarkey? Well, it's mostly malarkey. Let's these are the numbers of animals killed in the United States each year. So these numbers on the vertical axis are billions, okay? So in terms of research, we in the United States kill roughly about 10 million animals in research. About 100 million animals are killed by hunters each year. Somewhere between probably 4 and 5 billion animals are killed by our pet cats. And then we eat about 10 billion animals a year. So at the same time, 66% of us say animals should have the same rights as humans. We clearly think that it's okay to eat these animals, these creatures that we think should have the same rights as us. Even vegetarians have problems with moral consistency. After Bill Clinton left the presidency, he decided to go, his health wasn't good. He decided to go vegan, and he went vegan. As far as I know, he's still a vegan. And I saw him in an interview, and he was raving about his newfound veganism. He was losing weight. He felt better than ever before. And then he just added at the end of this interview, he said, well, now I try and eat salmon once a week. Well, I got news for you, Bill. If you're vegan, vegans don't eat salmon. Well, the thing is Clinton unusual? Well, it turns out that he's not. So for example, the US Department of Agriculture conducted a phone survey of 20,000 Americans. About 5%, about 1,000 of them were vegetarians. And several weeks after they originally called them and asked them about their diet, they said they were vegetarians. The USDA phoned them back. And they said, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? Not the last week or the last month, the 24 hours. And what they found was that over 60% of the vegetarians had eaten some form of animal flesh in the previous 24 hours. And by the way, subsequent studies have shown the same thing. This is a pattern which has been persistent. So even vegetarians have problems with moral consistency. An issue which I've been thinking about a lot lately is related to what's been called the humanization of pets. There's been a change over about the last 30 years in how we think about the animals that we're closest to, particularly our dogs and cats, and particularly our dogs. And this was beautifully represented by this op-ed by Greg Burns, a great researcher, canine researcher who studies dog brains at Emory University. And he had a piece in the Times, and the headline was "Dogs are people too." And increasingly, we are think of dogs as people. Somewhere between 80 and 90% consider their pets to be full-fledged family members. However, if we really thought of dogs as people, if we really were going to humanize them, we do things to them that we wouldn't do to humans. For example, we wouldn't desex them. We wouldn't cut their reproductive organs out because it's inconvenient for us to, for them to have babies. We wouldn't, every time they wanted to go outside, put a leash around their neck and make them go for walks. We wouldn't decide increasingly every move that they make, except if it's to the dog park and they get to hang around with other dogs for a little bit, maybe 20 minutes or 30 minutes every now and then. So the sociologist Leslie Irvine, who's an animal lover and has dogs, is very conflicted about this. And she has written what I call the pet paradox. If we recognize the intrinsic value of animals' lives and their autonomy, then it's immoral for us to keep them for our pleasure, regardless of whether we call them companions or pets. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. One of after I finished my studies of rooster fighters, I studied animal activists. And I interviewed dozens of animal activists, spent a couple of years doing this. And I developed enormous respect for animal activists. They had a sense of moral clarity in their life that I found admirable, in part because I don't have it. But what I realized that they have it, in some ways it's tough, because what I call the animal activist paradox is the greater your moral clarity, the harder it is for you to be morally consistent. So maybe we can talk about that in a little bit, Chris. At one point when I was writing the proposal for my book, I was talking to my literary agent. We weren't quite on the same page in terms of what the issues were that we were dealing with. And at some point, I think it was after I wrote the chapter on meat, she says, "Oh, I get your book now. It's a big think book." I love that phrase. So I think it is a big think book. I think our relations with animals do raise big think issues. And so, for example, the issue of human exceptionalism. Are we fundamentally the same? Or are we fundamentally different from other animals? It raises the nature-nurture questions. Human behavior more a product of genes or environment? So, for example, a wonderful Swedish study recently found out that 40% of the differences in people and whether or not they have a dog in their life is attributable to their genes. And finally, how do we make these difficult moral judgments? Is it a matter of head? Is it a matter of heart? Is it logic? Is it intuition? So these are the big think issues. As Mark Beckhoff said, the ethologist Mark Beckhoff, when we study our relations with animals, we learn a lot about ourselves. And I'll just sort of mention that if you're interested in this, I do write a blog for Psychology Today magazine. Just Google animals and us, and Chris mentioned the book. So with that in mind, let's talk. I can stop the screen share here.
Oh my gosh. Such, just brain busters, Hal. just tell me how I'm supposed to think about it instead of making me think about it.
That's not my job. I don't tell people how to think. I get letters from people. They want advice. They want advice, and I almost never give it.
So real quick, I'll remind folks, use the chat boxes and the comment threads that are available to you there on the YouTube and on Facebook. I'll be grabbing your thoughts and questions from there as we go to incorporate them into the discussion. And so Hal, what's one of your favorite examples of why it's so hard to think straight about animals?
Well, one of the examples. Well, this is I think this is a good one because it deals with people that are intelligent. There was a study done recently by researchers at UCLA, and it was on vegetarians. And as I mentioned from that USDA study, most vegetarians eat meat. oftentimes on a daily basis. And they were particularly interested in vegetarians that ate fish. And I was sort of interested in this study because I had tried in the summer to convince my grandson when he was 5 that humans were made out of meat. And I failed to do so. He would not buy it. And so I said, all right, we'll make a little taxonomy of meat. Like, what do you consider meat? Is it chicken meat? And he said, yes. I said, well, what about Big Bird? No, Big Bird's not meat. I said, what about monkeys? Are they meat? And he said, yeah, unless they live in the United States, which I'm still puzzled by, but I think it's because he really liked Curious George. But he had this taxonomy. Elephants were not meat, cows were meat. But this taxonomy in some way didn't make any sense. But this UCLA study gets at this same issue. But remember, my grandson's 5 years old. And so these people were adults and they were vegetarians that ate fish. So one of the questions on their survey was, do you consider fish meat? And 40% of them said no. And so here we have people that, they eat fish, but yet fish are not made out of meat. And we all sort of have these little quirky things in our lives,
Okay, I have a follow-up. If the fish aren't made of meat, what are they made of?
Oh, that's a good question. And they did not ask that.
They didn't ask. I mean, that would mean they'd have to be made of plants, right?
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write the author of that paper. I know him, and I'm going to ask him about that.
Then what are fish made of? If it's not meat.
Well, it's okay. I think you're raising an interesting question. There's a subtext to that question, and my guess is that they're not really thinking about it. And my general, I've come to the conclusion that a lot of our relationships with animals, these inconsistencies, are that way because we don't think about them very deeply. We don't acknowledge that, well, if we say that animals should have the same rights as humans, then we don't have the right to eat them. So this seems to be a pretty common theme, that a lot of times we're not really thinking very deeply about these issues. And the people that do think about them, they do think about them seriously, and they they take these issues really seriously. And there's an upside of that, and there's a downside of that.
Let me grab some questions from the chat real quick, because we got some good ones coming in.
Sure.
So the first one that's up here is from Erla. How do we help farmers move from mass-raised chickens or hogs or lamb or et cetera, and move them to a way that they can still produce food and earn a living?
That's a terrific question, and I don't have an easy answer to that, except to say I think it's going to be impossible for us to meet the global demand for meat in a humane way. Meat consumption is going up. Let's take a look at meat consumption in the United States. In 1975, Peter Singer wrote his groundbreaking book, Animal Liberation. At that time, Americans ate on average about 170 pounds of meat per capita. We now eat about 240 pounds of meat per capita. And that number has fluctuated a little bit, but given all the talk you hear about vegetarianism and veganism, and like my little town, Asheville, there's at least 3, until COVID, there were 3 vegan restaurants, a bunch of vegetarian restaurants. I can go to the local grocery store and buy vegan stuff, vegetarian stuff. In reality, the number of people that are vegetarians has not gone up at all. 97% of Americans eat animal flesh, and that number has not fluctuated. If anything, our consumption of meat hasn't gone up much. We basically maxed out at between 220 and 240, basically over the last 15 years, and it hasn't gone down a bit. So the question is, how can we have our meat and eat it too? And I don't think we can do it with any form of humane agriculture. And that's why I'm a big fan of lab-grown meat. I think the future is lab-grown meat. And by the way, I eat meat. I've come to, I don't defend eating meat. I have no defense. My defense is that meat tastes good to me, and that's a terrible moral argument. If I were a better person, I would not eat meat. But I'm really hopeful for lab-grown meat. I want to be able to never eat real animal flesh again. I want to be able to get it from a big vat that comes in a railroad car down here from New Jersey.
Does it have to come from New Jersey? Can we get local lab-grown meat?
They have big vats of chemicals there. I've been there.
Right. Okay. Oh, well, I guess if they've got the resources. So then is the finding then from studying human-animal relationships, does it just sort of come down to that humans are morally inconsistent beings? It's just a feature of what it means to be a human, or are there examples of people who find that consistency and they get on that track and they stay with it?
Yeah, I think you're right on both counts. Let's talk about the average person, of which I consider myself an average person. I'm inconsistent as hell when it comes to my relationships with animals, and I really have no excuse because I know more about this stuff than most people. You know, but I think the problem that we have, the reason why it's so hard to think straight about animals is because it's really hard to think about most things that are ethical, that are ethical issues. And so, for example, we see the same issues when we talk about things like abortion, or when we talk about race. They're the same sorts of issues, and part of it's because our moral sense is this balancing act between our head and our heart. And I'm an advocate of a view of morality called the social intuitionist model, which is developed by a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, whose work I like an awful lot. And he argues that our moral judgments, not just about animals, about everything, is basically the function of two processes. And the most important one is what he calls system one, which is basically our guts. Is that it's our moral intuitions, so that we make if we make these moral judgments sort of at a gut level, and then system two, without thinking about it, it's rapid, it's instantaneous, it's unconscious, and it's intuitive. And then what happened is we have we're the species with the big brain. We're the species that has this degree of rationality that no other creature even comes close to. And the function of this cortex is basically to make sense, come up with some kind of wacky logic, like my rooster fighters' wacky logic. They had a whole moral system to justify why rooster fighting was so great and why it was even good for chickens, But they made sense of something that was intuitively plausible for them. And then with the animals, it gets really complicated because we have the categories that we put them in. We have biological stuff. For example, it's quite, our attraction to animals that are cute has an instinctive basis. Our fear of things like snakes might have at least partially a genetic basis. And then we have language and we have culture. So all these things make for this mix of things that make it really tough to think straight about animals. But then some people do manage to rise above it. And they take these issues seriously, and they do try and be consistent. And even they have trouble with complete consistency.
I guess we all live in the same small world or big world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And even when you're trying to be consistent, there are structural frameworks around you that would be difficult to push back against if you're at the edges of the bell curve.
I think that's exactly correct. And so, for example, with animal activists, I interviewed activists. Some of them told me that they felt, and these were very intelligent people, by the way, very intelligent, morally serious people. Some of them told me that they confessed that they felt guilty driving their car because of the bugs that were smashed on their windshield, or they found out that the tires had been made with animal products. People that would take I remember talking to a woman who was an IBM executive that told me she would take her dog outside and she would try and take the fleas and ticks off her dog and set them free, so she wouldn't have to kill them. And when the termites came to to eat her house, she had this moral struggle about whether the termites had the right to eat her house down. She concluded that they didn't, but she felt bad about it, fumigating them.
Right, right. I have dealt with termites. I did not have a moral quandary.
Right.
But okay, lots of questions are rolling in here. So let me grab some more good ones that are coming up here. Diane says, "Hi, Dr. H. Can you please talk about, can you please talk about the relationship between religion and belief systems and anthrozoology? P.S. Met you at ISAZ 2019 and referenced you in my anthrozoology MA dissertation at Exeter."
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. It's interesting. I had not thought a whole lot about this. And then as I mentioned to you when we were talking the other day, I gave a talk to a class, a Zoom talk to a class, and the instructor knew my work pretty well. She said, there's the last couple of chapters of your book has a lot of religious themes in it. And I had to go back and look at them. I realized it myself. Yeah, there are those there. They snuck in there. I wasn't even aware of it. I think there are, first of all, religion plays into animal stuff in many ways. So for example, why are dogs reviled in some cultures and loved in other cultures? Well, in some cultures, they're reviled because of religion. So for example, in some sects of Islam and in Hinduism, dogs are considered vermin. And they would never eat dog in those cultures because they considered dogs, they're taboo. It's because they find them disgusting. You're not supposed to touch a dog for religious reasons. On the other hand, there's some places where dogs are seen as being, dogs and cats are seen as being like really, really important religiously and religious icon. So, with dogs, we don't eat them for one reason, but they're not eaten in India and Saudi Arabia for completely opposite reasons because they're seen as being disgusting. I think in some ways, animal activism has some religious components to it. We did some studies of animal activists, and we found out for the most part that they were not conventionally religious. That wasn't true of all of them. Some were, but most were not. But yet, they had some religious elements to their conversion to this new perspective. For one, their lives changed. For another, that they had seen a new way of looking at the world, and they had a truth that other people didn't have. And so in many cases, I remember one woman telling me, she said it was about the circus coming to town. They were having a parade in her downtown, and she was sort of saying, I'm a mom, I've got kids, and they really want to go to the circus, but I can't take them. And she said, sometimes I feel I don't want to be Jesus anymore. I just want to be a regular person, but I can't. So there are some deep religious themes going on in some of these areas.
Interesting stuff. How do you think then, how have our relationships with animals changed in even just the last few decades? Because, for example, I would have thought that the number of vegetarians has been going up over time.
Yeah, everybody thinks that, but it's not true. The data speak for themselves, and the data that I'm using comes from a couple of sources. It's like the Vegetarian Resource Group and from Faunalytics, which is an animal rights group that runs the numbers on these things. So this is not numbers from the Meat Council or the Chicken Council or anything like that. These are numbers from animal rights groups. I don't really know. Let me just stop there.
So I'll grab another question from the chat over here. Karen is asking, are the attitudes you've studied in the United States found in other countries? And is it only affluent countries or classes?
uh, what we see in the United States is that most animal rights activists tend to be women. They tend to be middle and upper classes. You don't see very many men at animal rights, and you don't see many people of color in the movement. These attitudes vary tremendously by culture. And one of the studies that we've did recently was did a study of national differences in dog ownership. And what we discovered was whether or not you have a dog for a pet is primarily determined by geography. So for example, if you were to live in Saudi Arabia, only three people in 1,000 have a dog. In the United States, it's one of the highest rates of dog ownership in the world. About 240 or 250 people per 1,000 have a dog. If you go to France or Germany, it's about 125 people per 1,000 have a dog. So these attitudes are very very affected by the cultures that we live in.
Julie's asking, have you surveyed people to better understand what their reasons are for eating meat or not eating meat?
I have not, and that it's interesting that there's been there's a huge literature on why people become vegetarians, and there's not very little literature on why people become meat eaters. One of the things that's interesting is that 80% of vegetarians and 70% of vegans will eventually go back to eating meat. And so we do have research, again, conducted by animal welfare groups on why people go back to eating meat. And we have information on that. And the reason why they go back to eating meat, there's a handful of reasons. One of them is health reasons. I know a number of vegetarians and vegans who have gone back to eating meat at their doctor's recommendation, including some people that have been vegetarian or vegan for 20 or 30 years. Another reason is for social reasons. There's social pressure to eat meat. If you become a vegetarian, especially a vegan, oftentimes your friend groups change. People don't invite you out for dinner as much as they used to because they don't know what to make. A few of the people that we studied went back to eating meat because of meat cravings, but it wasn't very many. Interestingly enough, of the vegetarians that went back to eating meat that we studied, almost none of them went back to eating meat because they had a change in their moral thinking. Interestingly. By the way, I want to go back to the changes in attitudes towards pets for a second, towards animals for a second.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I think we've seen a big shift in the last 30 years, and I'm not sure quite why that's happened. I think part of it has to do with television, and we are. And the reason I'm thinking about that is because we think about pets differently than we used to. It used to be that a dog was a dog. And now that's no longer true. So for example, the money and there's been a huge growth in the pet products industry. It's now $100 billion a year industry. It's bigger than all professional sports. Most of that growth has been at the high end. So if you go to Ingles or you go to Publix or something like that, and you look at, you can buy, salmon with peas and carrots for your cat, and venison for your natural venison for your dog. And we have doggy day spas and all that other stuff. So we are in some ways thinking of, if I like salmon or venison, my cat or my dog is too. And I think part of that had to do with things like shows like Lassie and stuff like that, Timmy would fall in the well and Lassie would rescue him. And so when you bring a dog into your life, it's this creature. And dogs, I think, in some ways become like, they've been called an ambassador species, because once we bring a dog into our life, or less so with a cat, a dog into our life, you see that that's a creature with a mind and that has emotions, all those things that I mentioned in the beginning. And in some level, you then begin to think, hey, if dogs have feelings and if dogs have emotions and if dogs can sense things like love and fear and all that stuff, what about other animals? And so we see this expansion of this moral circle, as Peter Singer puts it. Interestingly enough, it's been very successful in some ways. The most successful behavior change and associated with our treatment of animals has been the spay and neuter movement. So back in the 1970s in the United States, we were killing something like 75 or 80 million 75 or 80 million dogs and cats a year in animal shelters. And now we're down to less than 2 million. And that's because of changing the way that we think about, unwanted animals. So that's been incredibly successful. On the other hand, we're killing 10 billion animals for our dining pleasure. And that number has not gone down, it's gone up. So it's that paradox.
Paradoxes. Okay. I'm going to jump back into the chat so that I don't have to think about it. I'll let these people think about it. Tom on Facebook is struggling. He says, I'm a bit guilty that my cat is indoor only, but at least he isn't killing lots of birds. I do wonder if ethically it's okay to keep a pet. Am I doing a disservice to my cat not letting him live a wild life?
Okay, I'm gonna give an answer to that is just for me, and I am more conflicted over this than any other animal issue. It's personal for me because I have my cat, and she's not around right now. You know why she's not around? She's outside hunting. And so I really struggle with this. And my relationship, before COVID, my wife and I went down to the island of Tobago and spent a week. And I did what I usually do when I go anywhere is I look at the dogs that people have, the animals people have. And the dogs in Tobago are street dogs. Sometimes they get to go into houses, but they're not really owned. And but they looked healthy and they called their own shots. And if I were to come back in the next life as a dog, I think I would rather be a street dog on Tobago than I would be a dog in Weaverville, North Carolina, living in somebody's house that never got to go outside unless it had if it was on a leash. And so with my cat, I let her go. She calls her own shots. And she's a black cat, so she looks like a little Black Panther. And she gets to go outside when she wants to go outside. And I take great delight when she goes outside for a couple hours a day, usually, but sometimes longer. And sometimes she brings back things that are dead. And our cats, there's no question about that. They do take a toll. But on the other hand, I feel like I'm recognizing her autonomy, knowing full well that there's some coyotes around, and I fortunately live on a road that has virtually no traffic, so that's not a problem. But she's 11 years old now, and she's got to live the life I would like to live if I were a cat. And by the way, most of my friends, my anthrozoology research friends that have cats, they totally disagree with me on this. And so they keep their cats indoors. There are some health consequences of keeping cats indoors. They tend to have certain types of, they tend to have more behavior problems. They tend to have some urinary problems associated with stress. Some cats like living indoors. It's not a problem at all. My cat would hate it. So once again, I have no answers, and I'm not the moral model on this one.
All right. Jim writes, can we just agree mosquitoes are awful?
Yeah.
I think so.
Uh-huh. I'm in.
So. Now, that being said.
No, they're worse than awful. They're worse than awful. And this is the reason why. What is the animal that kills more people on Earth than any other animal? It's the mosquito. Mosquitoes. And it's hundreds of millions of people every year die because of mosquitoes. And the next one down on the list is pretty low, is way further down.
All right. Vanessa's asking, what do you think about the quote symbiotic relationship between pets and humans, dogs and cats? Would you describe our relationships as symbiotic or mutualistic even?
That's a very, very good question. Well, we could also add parasitic in there. And let me explain that one. There's a phenomenon in birds called nest parasites. And John Archer, a researcher from the UK, argues in some ways that dogs are nest parasites. Just take my cat, Tilly. I didn't ask to have a cat, Tilly. What happened is that her mother deposited her on my doorstep. And I came home one day and my wife had this funny, weird little grin on her face like I'd never seen before. And I heard this little meow. And the next thing you know, we've got a cat in our life. We've had this cat. We've been taking care of this cat, now for 11 years. And feeding it, just like with a nest parasite in a bird, what happens is that a cuckoo or a brown cowbird will lay its egg in the nest of, let's say, a wren or a sparrow or phoebe. And then the phoebe raises it. Then the brown thrasher, the brown cowbird, runs off, leaving the egg, leaving the other animal, the other bird, as a sucker to take care of it, which is what I've done with Tilly. I think in some relationship I think they are in some ways symbiotic. Let's talk about mutualistic. The question is, what do we? That's something that I've been dealing with a lot lately, because I think the claims made that pets are good for us are way overrated by the pet products industry. And one of the surprises I got in writing my book was the research on the impact of pets keeping on human health. And the pet products industry tells you over and over again, I see these papers all the time that, if you get a pet, your chances of dying of heart disease is going to go down. Your kids are going to be less shy and less anxious. You're going to be less lonely and you're going to be less depressed. And I was really never interested in human-pet relationships until I wrote that book. And the reason is that it seems like everybody else was doing it. They really didn't need me to look at that literature. But I had to write a chapter on pets when I wrote the book. And so I started looking more deeply at the actual research evidence that pets are good for people. And I was really surprised because I know people that do research in that area. I've been to many, many conference talks where people would talk about, that oxytocin flows when you pet your dog. And, people with pets are low, slowly depressed and stuff like that. Most of those studies are flawed. And furthermore, if you actually do a deep dive into that literature, what you find is surprising. So for example, and I did this in part, because I write this blog for Psychology Today, and I sort of take these issues on. So for example, I recently looked at all the papers I could find on the claim that pet owners are less depressed. And I found 30 published papers published in peer-reviewed journals in which they compared depression levels in pet owners and non-owners. 5 of the papers found that pet owners were less depressed. 5 of the papers found that pet owners were more depressed than non-owners. And 20 of the papers found no difference between pet owners and non-owners. So the predominance of evidence does not support the claim that getting a pet will make you less depressed. I found the same thing with loneliness. One of the problems, you say, pet owners are more likely to die less from heart disease, to have lower blood pressure, to get more exercise and stuff like that. Well, the problem is we have what's called the causal arrow problem. What we know about pet keepers is in the United States, they tend to have more money. They tend to live in houses rather than apartments and trailers and stuff like that. They tend to be younger. They tend to be married. There's a whole bunch of health indicators that they are better off as. And it's not related to the fact that they have pets. In other words, pet owners, it's not that pets cause better health. It's that you have the energy and the money to have a pet, and it's having money and energy are more likely to cause you to be a pet owner. So, there's some evidence that pets are good for us. And we know from our personal experience that they're good for us. We feel better. I feel like my cat makes me less depressed. The research doesn't support that nearly as much as I want it to. I'm sorry. So I'm not sure about this mutualistic thing, at least from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing, right? I know me in my life, if I'm feeling stressed or anxious, feel like I need a break, I take the dog for a walk. So why wouldn't I say that the dog is helping me deal with a tough moment? But I guess, right? I could have just taken a walk without the dog.
Well,
I'm gonna have to do a study.
I think the dog can get you through the tough moment, help you get through the tough moment. And I think the literature, I think the studies are good when it comes to short-term impacts of, for example, I know, if I'm watching television in the evening and Tilly comes and sits in my lap and I pet her, I feel better. She purrs, she looks at me, she gives me some respect, which is tough coming from a cat, that lives in the wildlife, So I think there's very good evidence that interacting with pets causes lower blood pressure, temporarily and things like that. The question is, in the long run, do they have these impacts? And there, the evidence is, I shouldn't say they don't have any. I don't want to say that they don't have any impact. I'll simply say that the evidence is not as good as most people think it is. It's not as good as the pet products industry wants you to think it is.
Julie asked a somewhat related question that I think this is interesting. There's a lot going on here. Would public service announcements, TV commercials in other countries be a good way to get more people to think about dogs like family members versus guard dogs, and gives an example of Nepal street dogs?
I suspect so. Yeah, I think that the media does have a big impact on the way that we think about animals. And so take, for example, movies like Blackfish or Free Willy. They had big impact. The Disney movie Bambi caused a shift in attitudes toward hunting in the United States when it first came out. So I think the answer to that is yes. I'm not sure about public service announcements, but she's also correct about street dogs serving the role of watchdogs. I had this is a good example of cultural differences. I've got a friend that's an anthropologist who was raised in rural Kenya, and they had dogs in his village. And I said one time, I said, Nyaga, would you let a dog in your house? In the huts, people were living in sort of these hut things. And he said no. I said, would you like, did you guys like feed your dog food? He said no. I said, would you let the dog sleep, eat at your table? He said no. I said, would you let the dog sleep in your bed? He said no. And the look on his face was like a rat. Would you let a rat sleep in your bed? And I said, well, why do you have these dogs around? He said, well, we want them to scare away strangers and animals from our gardens. And then I said, in your language, is there a word for pet? And he said, no. He said, we don't have the concept of a pet. So the idea that pet keeping is a culturally universal is not true. Pets are widespread, but they're not universal in every culture.
You may have already given an example of this, but what do you think is our most morally fraught relationship?
Yeah, well, in terms of quantity, it's eating animals. There's no question about that. In terms of ethical conflict, I think it's the use of animals in research. We don't need circuses. We don't need cockfighting. We don't need hunting. We don't need recreational fishing and stuff like that. We're looking at a pandemic right now, which could kill and will kill many millions of people. And the question is, there's two questions. One is, would animal research facilitate the ability to develop treatments or vaccines for this? And that in itself is fraught. Animal rights activists a lot of time would say no. If anything, animal research is going to set us back. On the other hand, the drug company, the pharmaceutical companies, and a lot of animal researchers would say, yes, no, we're really learning enough. We're learning enough that's going to help us come up with the treatment. But the other thing is, what if we could, what if does it matter ethically if it would save a lot of people? And the example I use in my book is is what I call the ET problem. And I sort of, we're running out of time, but it's the question of like, when I watch the movie ET with my kids, at the end of the movie, ET comes down to Earth. I mean, ET's mom comes down to Earth and takes ET by the, and ET's getting ready to go up the ramp and go into the flying saucer and fly away. And he looks at Elliot and he says, come with me, his pal Elliot. And Elliot says no, And but what if he had grabbed Elliot by the arm and dragged him into the mothership because they had a COVID type virus on Orc, and they needed humans as a medical model. And the Orcians were smarter than us, and they had bigger brains, and they were spiritually more advanced. Would ET have the right to take Elliot and use Elliot for primate research? And when I asked my kids that, they were like 6 or 7 years old. Hey, Betsy and Katie, do you think Elliot should be put in the alien breeding colony and used for research? They go, no, Daddy, no. But at the same time, I was at that time doing animal research myself. And I realized, the stuff I do would not, I was struggling over my own ET problem. So I think animal research is the toughest issue.
The ET. Oh man, that got me. Okay, there's just a couple of minutes left, and just a couple more questions that I want to throw your way, if that's all right.
Sure.
Bianca says, thanks, Hal, for your talk. What is your opinion on how to draw a line between believing that animals should have the same rights as humans and anthropomorphizing them?
Yeah, I think that drawing the line is really that's the ethically fraught question, is where do we draw the line? And one of the problems we have is linguistic, is when we talk about animals, this category of animals, it does include mosquitoes. It includes gorillas and apes and animals that are so much like us. So the question is, where do we draw that line? And different people are going to, and I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for that. I've served on animal care committees, and I've done research on animal committees, and they have that. And I think with animal research, you have to draw those lines. People are forced to draw those lines. And it really depends on a couple of things. You draw the line depending on the likelihood that the research is going to succeed. You draw it on how much pain and suffering is going to be involved, and how important the research is. Are lives going to be saved, or is it for somebody's obscure paper that nobody's ever going to read? And Stephen Wise is the animal rights legal expert and philosopher that's done the most with that. And he has written a book, which I think the name of his book is like Drawing the Line. And he came up with some research things where we could actually do research on the cognitive abilities of animals to try and help us to draw that line.
Katie Alman here in the chat posed something similar, which was to say, how do we fit in as animals, or how do we challenge people who don't see themselves as members of?
Well, okay, I'll just be quite honest. I'm a speciesist at heart. And I do think that there are some morally relevant differences between people and other species. And let me give an example of that, if I can, really quickly. And let's say we were in Africa, and we were on a photo safari, and we're at some water hole, and we see an impala, drinking from the water at the water hole. And then and we also see that there's a leopard stalking the impala, and the leopard's going to pounce on him and probably kill him. And what should we do? Should we get up there and wave our arms and scare the impala away and save its life? Most animal protectionists would say, no, we shouldn't do that. all right, let's say the next day we go back to the water hole and the leopard's hungry now, really hungry because we waved our hands before. And let's say that the 4-year-old child, that's the child of our guide, is over there by the water hole, and he's getting a drink of water, and the leopard is stalking him. What should we do? And to me, there's a real difference there. In the case of the child, hell yes, you should scare the leopard away and save the child. With the impala, I think no. You're not in the position of deciding who's to live and who's to die. And so to me, that's just sort of, I've been thinking about that example for a long time. And to me, that there's a fundamental difference between humans and the fact that we have to make that decision, and no chimpanzee, no gorilla could understand that and make that. So I do think that there are some morally relevant differences between humans and all the other species. Now, that doesn't give us the right to do what we want to with them. In fact, that gives us a degree of moral responsibility that other species don't have. I don't get mad at my cat when she goes out and kills a bird. If anything, I should get mad at myself for letting her do that, which I sort of do. I do.
Last one, we'll close on this one. Are some cultures more consistent than others with their attitudes towards animals?
So it's a really terrific question. My inclination would, I don't know. I haven't studied that, and I don't know of a moral consistency scale that we could get at that. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to know. We know that some people are more morally consistent than others, but I suspect that there are. So, for example, we mentioned religion before, and my guess is that Buddhists are probably more consistent. And my guess is that, for example, there's the Jains, which are very morally consistent, and so I haven't studied them, but so morally consistent that they will sweep off the sidewalk and that they're walking on to keep the ants so they won't be killing ants. So I think yes, I think there are societies that are more morally consistent, and I think there are societies in which we can see moral progress. I think and I think our society is one of those. We have seen some moral progress in some areas. The changing attitudes towards circuses, changing attitudes toward cockfighting. Cockfighting is now illegal in all states, and it's against a federal law, which I think that's a good thing. The fact that we're not killing nearly as many animals in animal shelters as we used to, that's a sign of moral progress. We have not made much moral progress when it comes to eating animals, the biggest.
All right. On that, Hal, thanks so much for being with us for a book night at the Science Cafe.
Hey, thanks. This is fun. Great questions.
Yeah, what a great crowd. Fantastic questions. I think to a point that you made before the show, everybody's going to be leaving with lots to think about.
Good.
No answers whatsoever. But I think the discussions will continue from here. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and let everybody know, if you're still with us, the first Thursday night of the month, starting tonight with Hal, we are calling book night. So next first Thursday, it's the first Thursday of December 3rd. Our book will be Wicked Plants by Amy Stewart. So you'll be able to pick up a copy of the book at the museum store, give it a read, and then you can join us right here for our virtual program on December 3rd for a conversation and presentation about wicked plants. And keep an eye on naturalsciences.org to see what books will be coming up in the future. Again, first Thursday, new series. We're making the first Thursday of each month book night, and hope that you'll join and spread the word about our programs. If you enjoyed this, come back for the next one. I hope that we'll see you again real soon. Follow the museum on social media. We're at Natural Sciences on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. There you can get updates about this program, our virtual science cafe, as well as lots more interesting things happening at the Museum of Natural Sciences. Do-it-yourself programs. There's a whole lot of cool stuff going on. Next week even, we'll be celebrating Darwin Day on the 14th with day-long programming. So lots happening. Check out the website. follow the museum on social. Oh, and if you like the virtual programs that you get right here at the museum's YouTube, then you can subscribe, click the button down there below the video, and then click the bell to get notified. When we go live on the channel, you'll know about it and you can come join us right here with more of those great questions that you all had. So I hope we'll see you all again real soon. If not in person at the museum, then right here on YouTube. Thanks for joining me once again, Hal. This has been fantastic. Everybody, if you scroll up into the chat, you can click the link to buy a copy of the book. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Stay safe, everybody. And go pet a dog or a cat or something. I think so. I'm going to go find my dog after this because I need something to show me love.
Oh, I agree.
Even if
there is a mismatch between the research and what
you can cut this at any time, Brent. I'm just going to keep rolling because my head's spinning in so many directions.